Program and the Education Arcade at MIT. His research explores how educational technology, games, and computer simulations can be tools for teaching cognitive and computational thinking skills. His work spans the educational technology ecosystem from designing and developing new technologies, professional development, to AI literacy in education. And we also have with us some of his students, Jacob, Omar, and Ivy. Jacob is a PhD student at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Omar is an undergrad student at MIT studying computer science and media studies, and Ivy is studying electrical engineering and computer science at MIT with a concentration in educational studies. And for today's webinar session, the structure of it will be, we'll start with a 30-minute fireside chat with Eric about his research findings on AI in education. Then after that, we'll follow up with a 20-minute discussion involving the students. And after that, we'll end with a 10-minute Q&A where we'll open up to the audience. If you have any questions, make sure to enter it through the Q&A session part of the chat. And at the end, the last 10 minutes of the session, we'll get to those questions. Now, and yeah, right. At this time, I want to welcome Eric Klopfer, Professor Eric Klopfer. First of all, Professor Eric, thank you so much for attending today's session, and thank you so much for taking the time to come here as well.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for coming to this first webinar.
Yeah. So to start with some of the questions, so just want to get to know. So as the director of the MIT Scheller Teacher Education Program, we know that one of the center's missions is to design and create new powerful learning experiences with technologies. Could you share what initially sparked your interest in exploring the use of AI tools in education?
Sure. I'm gonna take a second though to first reflect on the question that you asked at the beginning with the poll, and then I'll answer that question because I think it was a really great question that you asked about should we be changing assessment in light of AI, I think as we saw most people thought it was either extremely important or very important. And if I can guess, I think there's two reasons why people might think that. So one is that people think that that given that AI is out there, that our current assessments are not effective because people will cheat on them. They will use AI to sort of find other resources, to get around them, to look up answers, to write essays, whatever it is that they might be doing. And I think that's a legitimate concern, although I think it's not as important as the second reason why someone might answer that question in the affirmative, which is that we think that the outcomes that students should be having now should be changing. Given that we have AI, that AI will be part of people's lives for pretty much from now on, we need to think about how the outcomes might change that we're expecting of students to achieve. And in that case, then we need to be changing the assessments because we're expecting different kind of things for them to learn along the way. In my mind, that's the more important one, that we actually need to be thinking about what's changing in the world, what kind of things that do students need to know now in the age of AI that they didn't before or that have become more important because of that. And so we should change our assessments to better accommodate the kinds of things that we expect them to learn. So that is what now I'll sort of get back to your question. That's what gets me excited about AI and why I think we should be thinking about it now, because it does sort of permit students to do different kinds of things. We should be thinking about different kinds of outcomes that come from AI. In some ways, it's sort of brought to light different kinds of outcomes that educators, education researchers have thought about all along that are more durable kinds of learning. Students shouldn't be anything that AI can answer now is something that maybe wasn't that important for students to know all along. It was just sort of easy for us to assess. Now we feel like, okay, this is an opportunity for us to say, okay, we've really reached the point where those outcomes are sort of no longer sufficient. And we need to think about what kinds of other learning that students should be having and what kinds of experiences we can create for them to be able to do that. So I think AI presents us with an opportunity and a challenge at the same time that we can think about in terms of how to address those concerns. I do think AI sort of permits different kinds of creative learning experiences. Sometimes we think about all the ways that it might hamper students by sort of shortcutting good learning, but it also provides students with good learning opportunities. Students can create things with AI that they might not have been able to do before. Maybe it will support students in sort of more ambitious challenges that they can take on. Maybe it will allow them to collaborate in different kinds of ways. Maybe it will be able to help them sort of share things with other people that they might not have before. So I think it really provides some really interesting opportunities that we didn't have before with other kinds of tools.
See. And I guess in like your initial discoveries or in your initial spark for this field, has there been any initial discoveries or findings in particular beforehand, like anything sort of that you read up on or saw that took you by surprise? Or for example, you mentioned like some, technologies that students are using to create other things or to make or build certain projects. Is there any specific examples or things that you saw, or not just technologies that they use, but some of the things that they created that I guess took you back or took you back in that yeah took you back in that specific way.
Yeah, I mean, so I look at at some of the kinds of projects that I see students working on. Sometimes it's about simply and we've seen students uncover bias in just looking at sort of representations of pictures that are generated from AI. And then it's about thinking about, okay, that's not AI that's generating that bias in some ways. It's the data set that they're based on, which is biased. And so they might do analysis of, the classic thing is, what is a picture of a physicist look like, or what does a picture of a teacher look like? And you see, you see sort of when you enter that into a lot of the image generation engines, you see all sorts of biased pictures. But then you can go back and look at Google when you do that search, and you'll also find that there's a biased set of pictures that are there in those data sets. So you see them sort of understanding, like, okay, I'm understanding how AI is sort of generating these images. I'm understanding where those images come from. I'm understanding where bias sort of exists in both representation and maybe even in terms of the careers that people have sort of felt like were appropriate for them based on a lot of pre-existing biases that exist in the system. So it's really interesting to sort of see that whole sort of cognitive process go through from, like, this isn't just sort of AI coming up with something, but this is AI sort of as part of a larger sort of social technical system where these problems exist.
I see. And I learned that you conducted an experiment in your class recently that really got your students to think about AI's role in their learning. Could you describe that experiment and what inspired you to explore that idea?
Yeah, so I taught a course for the first time last fall on teaching computer science. So it was a course about for MIT students and one Harvard student for about teaching computer science at the K-12 level, and it was taking sort of a historical perspective, like how have we taught computer science from the very beginning, in the early 70s, in K-12 schools to today, and so when we think about today. The role of AI is particularly important in that. I think as we think about places that AI is being disruptive, certainly programming, coding, computer science seems to be sort of top of the list that people think about. From complex agents that are allegedly competent software engineers to people who are just sort of using coding help, to IDEs that have code support developed into them. It's sort of a really part of the way that people think about computer science now. And in fact, in some ways, sort of not using AI is probably sort of not doing your job correctly in many ways to think about it.
Hmm.
So I wanted to think about, and we'd actually had some previous conversations in class about the way that people had used AI. And in fact, the class really had quite a range. We did one of those activities where people sort of like line up across the room for people who use AI a lot on one side of the room and people who use AI not at all on the other side of the room. And we actually had quite a distribution of students in terms of the way they thought about it in their own work. But then I decided to do an experiment, and I asked the students. I said, okay, you're going to divide up into 3 groups. Each group is going to need to solve a particular programming challenge. And that programming challenge was in the language Fortran, which is a language that nobody really uses anymore. And it's a little bit of an esoteric language. It's not just sort of a one-to-one mapping of a lot of other programming languages. And it's one that I knew at one point in time. And so I gave people a simple programming challenge and said, you're welcome to use particular tools to solve that challenge. And then you'll have a chance to study, and then you're going to be given sort of a closed book test where you need to sort of answer a very similar challenge, but without the use of the technology provided with you. And the three groups were given, one group was able to use ChatGPT to solve the problem. Another group was given access to Code Llama, which is an open source tool that's not quite as good as ChatGPT in many ways. And the last group was given access just to Google, but without any AI. And then they were asked to solve the problem. And so maybe I'll pause for a second to see, like, for people to reflect and think about, like, what do they think happened in this experiment before I tell what happened.
Yes.
And maybe I'll just ask people, like, throw comments in the chat, and I'll kind of look at them and see what do you think happened in this experiment. So one group was given ChatGPT, one group was given Google, one group was given Code Llama, and they were given an opportunity to solve the initial problem and then a closed book test to solve the same kind of problem.
So you got some responses in the chat already. Yeah, I think
Yep.
it's a bit varied in the responses. Some saying ChatGPT did the best, some saying Google did the best. I think so. I think I saw a comment about like how Google users
Yep.
scored the best and on the closed book test. ChatGPT finished first, but didn't have much of an advantage. I think that's um sort of the consensus going on.
I have to make an apology for saying that Fortran isn't used so much. Someone pointed out that astrophysicists still use it, so my apologies there. Fortunately, nobody in the class was an astrophysicist, so they didn't know it to begin with.
That would be interesting. Yeah, I think Fortran is a relatively old language. I know some of the professors I talk with talked about how they used to use it. Now it's more, like Java, C, C++, Python, that stuff.
The student, so I see a couple questions in here. I think people took about 20-25 minutes to sort of solve the initial problem. It might have been as long as half an hour. My students will correct me if I'm wrong. It's probably felt like longer for some of them. It was we used ChatGPT 4 and it was Code Llama 2. So this was late in the fall. It's probably November timeline from last year. So people this is great. I love the reflections here. So I'll reveal what happened. In this experiment, it was a form. Someone asked, this was just a formative activity. So it was really, the idea was to have students reflect on what was going on here. So the ChatGPT group solved the problem pretty quickly and correctly. I think one subgroup needed to be able to sort of prompt engineer a little bit better to be able to get the answer correct. And then the next group, the Code Llama group, struggled a little bit more. It took them a while. It gave them answers pretty quickly, but the answers didn't work. And so they needed to do some extra work to be able to get it to work correctly. And then the Google group took the longest to be able to solve the problem. And in fact, they couldn't find just an answer to the problem on the internet, so they actually had to break the problem down to some components and answer those problems each independently, and then come up with a solution. So they all eventually came up with a solution to the first problem. And then they were given a chance to study, and then try to answer the second question with a closed book. And the ChatGPT group, none of them were able to get it correct. In the Code Llama group, I think half of the students got it correct. And in the Google group, all the students got it correct. And so, this is not a scientific experiment. This is a little activity in class, as the students will reflect on here. But I think it, I couldn't have planned it any better. I think there's a sense of like of productive struggle that really the ChatGPT group didn't go through. There's a sense that learning shouldn't feel frictionless. We talk about, in education, we talk about the zone of proximal development. So this is a zone where you're sort of somewhat challenged, where things are just a little bit out of your reach and you keep striving for that next thing. And that's where the best learning happens. It doesn't happen in the area that's like in the center that's green, like where like learning is really easy. That's not where the best learning happens. And it doesn't happen where it's too far out of your reach either. It really is about sort of like having problems that are just like a little bit out of your reach that feel like they're challenging. And that's really where the best learning happens. You need to struggle a little bit. You need to think a little bit. You need to reflect on it a little bit. As Ivy may talk about, it's really about also thinking about how you break problems down. It's not
I'm
just about
sorry.
learning
No, come
syntax.
on in.
Oops.
Thank you.
So it really is about sort of a much more sort of metacognitive process that you need to think about in order to be able to really solve these problems effectively. And in that example, I didn't care whether anybody learned Fortran. And in many cases, it may not be the fact that you're sort of trying to learn specific syntax or programming commands, but you need to be able to think about how you solve problems. And you're not learning that when you sort of just get the answer sort of spit out to you in an AI chatbot.
I see. I wanted to ask like a follow-up on what have been some of the key findings and insights, but yeah, I think as you mentioned, like obviously ChatGPT, the AI users, they're able to solve it faster, but they sort of had like the answer kind of crafted for them, the syntax for them, whereas the Google users, they were able to think about it for a long time, but that long time allowed them to think about different strategies and understand how to use Fortran and now understand how to solve that kind of problem. And that was I think that sort of summarizes like the main insight and finding from it. But has there been like any other specific like key findings and insights from the experiment as well?
No, I mean, I think it's also a lot of people, including myself, reflect on the era of calculators, and how we sort of thought about using them in the classroom. And I think there's a really good parallel here. At first we banned calculators from classrooms. Then we tolerated them in classrooms, and then we required them in classrooms. And part of that transformation is sort of like we could talk about it is sort of the inevitable that calculators are here and people are going to need to use them. But it did sort of transform the way we thought about mathematics education to some extent, where we really thought about it's not, yes, everybody needs to learn arithmetic. It's very important. And if you rely on your calculator all the time, you won't really be able to do math very well. However, there are times, many times, in fact, where we're sort of thinking about solving mathematics problems where the arithmetic is just something we want to sort of offload into some other support system that allows us to think about the important mathematical concepts we're dealing with. So if I'm doing statistical work, maybe sort of calculating the standard deviation, like the actual mathematics of that, well, I should know it. I don't actually need to do every time. I can sort of enter it into calculator. It tells me what the standard deviation is. I need to understand how to apply that, how to help me solve problems with that. It sort of provides a lot of assets for me doing really important mathematical thinking. And that's the calculator can't do that. And we shifted our mathematics education to sort of emphasize those aspects, particularly in upper level math. It might be the same sort of transformation we go through in lots of other domains now, including computer science. It might be where we think about computer science, maybe the sort of supporting the syntax and the structure of simple algorithms can be supported by AI, but sort of solving the more complex problem is something that people need to work on together. If I'm writing an essay, maybe my grammar like I have now, or maybe sort of helping me with an outline is something that I might be able to do with the support of AI. But it really sort of writing the whole thing for me is going to sort of shortcut my own learning is probably not a good place to help me. So teachers need to think about the ways that we design our curriculum and our assessment to be able to better support the kinds of learning we want in there. But it's also really important to think about how we teach that to the students, to think about where you're shortcutting your own learning by sort of using those tools. So there's the idea that we should be able to have all students do writing in class. I don't agree with that. I feel like there's really important opportunities to be able to have students do writing outside of class. And we're not going to be able to sort of get rid of cheating entirely in AI detectors. I see here AI detectors don't work. Here's what to do instead. That's a really great, it's really great to sort of think about that kind of thing. AI detectors don't work. We shouldn't rely on them. Instead, we should be thinking about ways that we have writing assignments that sort of emphasize the things that we want, that we don't think AI is good at writing. And we should be teaching students how not to rely on them and when not to rely on them, when it's actually not helpful for them to rely on those tools.
I see. Yeah, I wanted to
See,
ask as
I
well.
see here also, like it was this just because it really resonates. I see someone here rethinking how to shift from grades to learning will help greatly reduce the reliance on AI, and that's key to my last point here. That really it's about if students are valuing their learning and their outcomes, which is partly that we need to help them learn as teachers, then that becomes much less of a problem.
I see. I actually, yeah, I think the, especially the calculator example you gave at the beginning, I thought that was like a really good comparison because, you know, like before you learn how to use a calculator, you should be able to, be able to do arithmetic on your own, and then calculators help you do that faster. And I feel like AI has sort of that similar analogy as well. And I want to ask more about, obviously you saw some results from the experiment, but in general, how have you seen students who use generative AI software compared to those who don't in terms of, overall performance outside of the experiment and just in general from what you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen people use it really effectively. I've seen people use it to their detriment, and it goes in both my professional life as corresponding with other people as well as in my own classes as a teacher. I will say I recently got an email from somebody, and that email was addressed to that person. So it was from Mr. X, and Mr. X writes me an email, "Dear Mr. X." And then writes the email and then signs it, Mr. X. Um, and uh, and I was like, this is really weird. Like, why would somebody write an email to themselves? And then I showed it to somebody else, and someone was like, well, that was clearly written by AI. And I was like, oh, that's what, like there were like words in there that like were just out of context and sort of didn't make a lot of sense, and there were lots of extra words in there for an email. And I realized that was the case, that person had thrown that response into ChatGPT and looked for a response, and it defeated their message. Like, first of all, obviously the fact that they didn't catch that it was written to themselves was a little bit of a problem, but the fact that it was not, it didn't really sort of like capture the essence of what you do in sort of an email, and it really was not effective. And I've seen that in student writing sometimes. I see sometimes where students will write something and I see that's a little fishy there. But for the most part, I think in my classes, the things that students write are sort of novel enough where it's really a hard thing to sort of get AI to write it for you. It can help you, so it can help support you in doing it. And I actually encourage that. We talk about our policies at MIT in terms of what we ask people to do, and we have several different sort of like guidelines for that. But the most important thing is to like be explicit about what your policies are around AI in your own classes. And in my class, it was you're allowed to use AI to help writing, but your writing is your own, and you should be able to both defend anything that you put in. So even if AI wrote it, if you put it in your paper, you better own that and be able to defend that thing that you said. And B, you shouldn't use it to shortcut your own learning. You should be able to use it sort of in ways that support your learning. And I think it's great if someone uses it to write an outline or to sort of help revise or reflect. But it shouldn't be the thing that sort of writes your email for you or your paper for you.
I see. And could you provide maybe some more specific examples of how generative AI has been successfully applied in non-CS subjects or even CS subjects in general? So, for example, obviously we've seen how AI it's more so like a tool from sort of the consensus of this. It's more so a tool to help assist in learning, but it shouldn't be there to help with the entire learning process or just give you answers like just writing an email or an essay on your own. But could you provide some examples of how AI has been successfully applied in non-CS subjects or even CS subjects and the unique benefits or challenges that have emerged from those contexts?
Yeah, I mean, so the literature is still emerging at this point, and I think at this point it's I've seen papers where it helps. I've seen papers where people say it doesn't help. There was a recent paper that came out where I'm trying to remember the context. I think it was in math, but I can't remember, where an AI tutor sort of helped performance but sort of decreased interest in the subject. And I think that's important things to think about. I think as we think about design of sort of AI supports for learning, we specifically design it. We have to understand that like learning is not just about remembering things from class. Learning is a social process. Learning is a process where we learn something about ourselves. We develop metacognition. We develop identity as part of that process. And the sort of the facts that we learn along the way sometimes are important. but are just part of the learning journey. And so any kind of AI support really needs to sort of recognize all those other aspects of learning, and think about the design of a learning experience that sort of supports all those things. So it may be that sort of AI tutors need to think about our metacognition, need to think about our identity, need to think about how we think about ourselves as learners. But it may be that we think about that larger learning experience where we need to make sure that that's happening from other people and that AI is supporting some other aspect of learning. So I think there's obviously a lot of potential there, but we really need to think about that sort of whole learning process and not just something that sort of supports, retention or remembering. I do think there's interesting opportunities to sort of use AI to sort of have a chat with a literary figure who doesn't exist. In ways to do that. I think it's useful to be able to support writers who are not confident about their writing, to be able to refine what they're doing or just sort of challenge them. I think it's important to be able to sort of maybe untangle some difficult concepts that you're wrestling with in a science subject and have it explained in different ways to you, where one of them might make sense to you. As we get better at sort of making multimodal AIs, maybe it will be that we can have it explained through pictures as well as words, as we've seen in recent examples. So I think those things are promising, but I do think the most important thing is to think about learning as a sort of a more complex ecosystem that's not just about sort of like getting you to remember things, right after you sort of interact with the material.
I see. Yeah, I think to follow back up on that, I think I agree, with AI in education, it should be more like a tool, but learning, like you said, it's about the whole process, the whole journey of, it's not just memorizing something that you learned in lecture or was going over in lecture. It's really about understanding its applications. And I feel that AI can only provide you like certain resources, but really the learning has to be done, you know, by yourself, and you understanding those concepts is something that really only you can do. But yeah, at this time though, I do want to transition to, I want to transition and also I want to get some of the students involved. So I wanted to dive deeper into these topics. Let's welcome Ivy, Omar, and Jacob to the discussion. And I'll now pass it on to Sophie.
Thank you, Eric. There was a lot of gem, and there are a lot more that I want to unpack, especially with a student's perspective. Let's start with the really interesting virtual experiment that you mentioned. And bring our attention to what the student experience might look like in that class when they were going through the experiment. One key term that I extracted from what Eric said was shortcutting learning. This is for Ivy, Eric, and Ivy, Omar, and Jacob. Can you describe your experience from that class and that experiment that you went through? What was your insights or reflection on what shortcutting of learning felt like or may look like, as well as what do you think from a more ecosystem perspective? What does a productive learning experience that might look like? I'm looking at the order on my screen. Do you want to start with Ivy and then Omar and Jacob?
Yeah, so at least for me, for a productive learning environment, especially during that experiment, I was in the group that had access to Google, but no access to AI. And I remember the groups that had AI were finished like 2 minutes in. They copy pasted the prompt into the tool, they were done. Meanwhile, my group was like effectively like kind of yelling at each other, being like, what the heck does this syntax do? But I think then we were able to complete the second prompt after. So I feel like it's a lot about being able to, I guess, take the skills and transfer them somewhere else and not just like get an answer to the current problem. I don't know if Omar and Jacob had thoughts.
Yeah, so I was in the group that had assistants. I cannot recall at this moment if I had ChatGPT or CodeLlama, but what I did was I was able to, prompt engineer and get the answer to the solution. And after that, what I did was a little bit, I've taken education classes before, and I've taken CS classes as a CS major myself. I sort of try to study the basics of what I thought would be necessary on the test. So instead of actually trying to learn Fortran, I took the route where I was trying to basically learn to the test. Wasn't really successful. I didn't build up those foundational Fortran skills because of that prompt engineering that I did. I was able to answer like one or two parts of the formative assessment really well because I did sort of anticipate some of the questions that were coming. Um, but it was something. It really felt like I was caught off guard on the assessment.
Yeah, I was in the ChatGPT group and can attest to the fact that I learned very little about Fortran during the experiment. But when we think about shortcutting learning and what makes for productive learning experiences, I do think it's interesting and important to ask about the context of learning. So we were all a group of students who'd all had programming experience before, had at least like one other programming language kind of like pretty securely under our belts. And so as I was engaging in the experiment, for me, the syntax of Fortran didn't really hold a lot of meaning in my life. Like I didn't really anticipate ever needing to use Fortran syntax again. And so for me, the access to ChatGPT was actually very helpful. I mean, it certainly didn't help in the assessment component of the experiment, but to accomplish the basic task of like writing the thing that I needed to write in Fortran, it was extremely helpful. And I guess it's not particularly surprising to me that I didn't learn very much Fortran, given that I was not actually that interested or didn't have like any kind of personal meaning associated with learning Fortran. Because I think about other experiences I have where I'm like trying to write one-off scripts and like random programming languages to like, accomplish small tasks that I need to do for random things. And I don't hold on to very much knowledge about those programming languages either, even when I use like documentation or Google, Stack Overflow, the various resources that are more conventional and traditional. So I do think that the context and like what is personally meaningful in a learning experience is extremely important when we think about like what makes a productive learning experience and where shortcuts can and cannot be made.
I love that. And following as a follow-up question, I also want to ask all three of you, have you observed any instances where AI tools have either impacted or reframed your understanding or mastery of learning materials? I want to put more emphasis on the reframing part because what I kind of picked out was there was a lot of emphasis on not just the content knowledge such as syntax, but also a lot of transfer with knowledge that goes beyond just one single subject area. And do we want to go in the same order and start with Ivy?
Yeah, sure. So,
Okay, let me repeat my question. That was a
Yeah.
bit long. My apologies. Have you observed any instances where AI tools have impacted or reframed your understanding or mastery of learning materials?
I think it has kind of shifted what I prioritize when I'm trying to learn a bit. So I used to, last semester during Eric's class, I actually did not use AI tools very often. In this semester, I found myself using them more because I guess there's like things that the AI does well and doesn't do well typically, at least in terms of like ChatGPT 4. Like I can't expect it to do anything very mathy or very logical. But for example, if I write an essay and I don't pay a lot of attention to the grammar, I just throw it into ChatGPT and ask it to fix my grammar mistakes. And as a result, I don't really prioritize the grammar learning aspect or particularly like how to write a good paper. I just am like, okay, here's all the information, turn it into something that is presentable. And I think it's kind of just reframed like as a result, like what I prioritize when I learn. It's like, do I need to pay attention to this or can the tool do it for me so I can focus on something else?
And I do want to ask a follow-up question because I do know you have a concentration education studies. What I heard is that by automating some of the lower level tasks such as grammar, you are able to focus more on the higher level of thinking when you write an essay. This works really well for higher ed education, particularly for all of you here since you're in really good schools. But what about for younger learners, for learners who are just starting to learn basic grammar? Just like how for students are just starting to learn arithmetic skills. What do you think the role of AI might look like? And I also want to invite Eric back to the conversation if you have any insights.
Oh, does Eric want to speak, or should I answer?
Yeah,
Sorry, I was
I
replying to a question in the chat here, so if you can repeat it for me.
Yes, absolutely. Ivy brought up a really interesting point where she mentioned that with the AI tools, it's automating a lot of lower level tasks so that we are able to focus on higher level thinking when we write an essay instead of being hyper fixated on just basic grammar. That works really well for higher education, I believe, because that's when we really focus on the thinking and critical thinking as the center of the curriculum. But what about for younger learners back in K-12, where grammar is still the center of the focus for learning?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to keep going back to the calculator, but I will anyway. So we don't let kids in like first, second, even third grade use calculators because we believe that building sort of a foundation in arithmetic is really important there. I think the same thing we can say for and there are lots of math teachers who said when ChatGPT first came on the scene, they said something like now all you other teachers know what it felt like to be a math teacher. Because now you have the calculator for language and you have the calculator for problem solving, etc. So I think to some extent, yeah, we do need to think about where it is appropriate to enter into the curriculum. And so it's not appropriate for kids in first, second, or third grade to be relying to write their essays there. I do think it's important somewhere along the line to start sort of integrating into the curriculum, though, and not only permitting it, but sort of fostering it. Because if we simply permit it, it's going to privilege a certain set of people that are sort of have the tools and have the whereabouts and have the technology and have the support from outside to be able to use those tools more effectively. And that's not going to be okay. If we think about this with an equity lens, we're going to be thinking about how do we make, if this is something people are going to be using, we need to make sure that everybody can use this effectively. And so that means using it in classes and thinking about how we're going to use it in classes. I actually talk about, and I haven't come up with this, other people have said this, but AI didn't sort of like create cheating, AI democratized cheating, right? So that for years, like there were people, if you had the resources, you could pay somebody to write your essay for you. And people did that. That shortcut their learning as well. Now you can have a mediocre essay writer at very low cost or no cost. It's not sort of creating the problem here. It's just sort of magnifying it. But if we want people to sort of, instead of just having AI write their essay, be able to support it in a really good way, we need to be able to think about ways we actually integrate it into schools and teaching.
Thank you, Eric. Maybe Jacob or Omar, do you have any comment or do you have any thoughts on the previous question where we were thinking about what are some of the examples in your life where you've observed AI impacted or reframed what learning or learning course materials look like?
Yeah, I want to go back to that question about kind of reframing based on experiences with artificial intelligence. I recently had an experience where I was using or perhaps attempting to use ChatGPT to help with a text analysis assignment. I was taking a text analysis, like quantitative text analysis course last semester, which is a field of computation that I don't have a ton of experience with. And in the final project, I was, which was like self-directed, I defined what I wanted to do, what I was trying to understand about a set of texts that I was working with. But I attempted to use ChatGPT to help with some of the lower level things in that assignment where I was I don't know, trying to make a topic model with some text. But because I didn't have a lot of experience with that field, I found that it was very easy to get derailed from my higher level goals as I followed ChatGPT's suggestions in the coding process that I was using. So while I thought that it was or was attempting to use it to support these lower level decisions, I almost felt like I was like falling down a rabbit hole as I like thought about the higher level tasks that I was attempting to accomplish. And I think that that's a relatively common experience with these like AI tools, both to support coding, but also to support other areas of learning, where the distinction, and someone mentioned this in the chat as well, the distinction between like lower level tasks and higher level tasks is not always extremely clear. And especially when we don't have a great grasp of the domains that we're working in, our navigation in those domains gets really directed by those lower level tasks that we're trying to accomplish. So like I would ask it to help like figure out how to do this topic modeling thing, and it wouldn't quite be what it wouldn't quite output where I was hoping to go at the higher level, but I would just like go with it, and that would, you know, slowly pull me away from my ultimate goal in the project. So I have been thinking a lot about the importance of having grounding in the domains that you're working in as you are trying to use the AI tools to support your learning and to support the work that you're doing, which is I would say quite a challenge for learners, because we often put people into domains that they are not particularly, or people put themselves into domains that they're not particularly experienced with because they want to learn about those domains. So it has certainly shaped how I am thinking about that kind of learning and those decision points that you make as you are working through challenges.
Thank you. And Omar?
Yeah, so I would have to agree, and I concur with the points made by Jacob and Ivy, as well as Eric. I feel like for lower level tasks on a personal level, stuff that I've used it for this semester, actually with I took another course with Eric this semester. It was about creating games for education, and our focus was really on sort of the game design at a more fundamental level and how that integrates with certain educational goals. And so my group wasn't really the most artistic group. So we and alongside some other groups, these were all group projects. We used I believe it was ChatGPT. We had access to ChatGPT 4, and we used that to generate images so we could focus more on the curriculum development and the integration of the game within a classroom context. I'd say, you know, between the fall when I had this CS education course and now, I've sort of looked at AI and AI tools as a way to sort of assist in things that I'm already quite knowledgeable about. So within, again, another classroom context would be translating what I have written down on, say, a Google document into LaTeX code. I am not very knowledgeable about LaTeX, and LaTeX is mostly used for formatting. And so there were certain things where I wasn't very clear on how to format, say, a certain equation. I would put that into ChatGPT and it would format it for me, and I would be able to see, oh, okay, this is the command that they use. And so I feel like once you're at a very high level, there are certain areas or certain things outside of your field that are necessary, but aren't sort of the focus of that field, such as LaTeX within, say, computer science assignments. That I've been able to use AI for, where I don't feel like it's super necessary to learn it, even though I know LaTeX at a basic level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I want to comment, because I think there's a theme in the examples, and I think again, this is an important, in addition to sort of teaching how to use these tools, it's when to teach people when not to use the tools. And you know, there's a theme here of like using AI, and this is the way I talk about it, using AI when I want to sort of get to a product that doesn't disrupt my process of learning. So, you know, if my goal is to sort of design a game, and I want to have some music or some art in the game that's going to help me get to that, the project is about the game design. It's not about, for me, the art or the music in those cases. You know, for my educational game design class, other classes that might be important, focusing on that area is really important. Or like, again, it's about the sort of the game design. So if I'm stuck on some part of programming the game, using AI to sort of help me sort of like get over that hump totally fine, because it's not about the programming for that class. It's about the sort of the product that I create at the end, and my design features that went into that. So I think there's a common theme here of like using AI when it doesn't disrupt my process of learning, because I know what my focus is. But sort of as other people have commented here, like it's not obvious to everybody what the focus of their learning is or what it should be. And so I think that it is important to sort of be really explicit about that as a teacher, about here are the things that I think are really important for you to learn. Here are the outcomes that I really think are important. Here's the places where you can't take shortcuts. And here's the place where you can, like, I'll comment like the art on some of the projects this year was really great. And there was a soundtrack in one of the games that was really great, which we never had before. And it was generated by AI. And that was fine because the game that was about sort of the interface of game design and pedagogy, and sort of having those features like made it nice, but didn't take away from the core learning there.
And on the note of all the nuances that we mentioned, I want to direct back the question to the students. What would be one advice, if you could, to give to educators looking to integrate AI tools into their classrooms? It could be either in the higher ed context or K-12 context. And let's reverse the order. Let's start with Jacob and then Omar and Ivy. One advice for educators who are looking to integrate AI.
Yeah, my piece of advice, I think, echoes similar to what Eric just shared. But I think it's really important for educators to be very clear about the learning goals that they hope to achieve in their classes, and to negotiate those with the students in their classes, such that the students are also on board with those learning goals and they match the students' desires for learning in that class. Because I think once you have a good set of learning goals as your starting point, it becomes a lot easier to determine how and why to use any tool that you might use in your learning, whether that's ChatGPT or, like, I don't know, a particular paintbrush that you're using in an art class. You really have to start with the learning goals before you can make a decision about the tools that you want to be using.
Yeah, to that extent, I don't think it's ever going to be a feasible policy moving forward to completely outright ban AI tools. I think in some way or another, they might be great for, say, ideation. Again, jumping back to that art example Jacob mentioned. For ideation, maybe you don't know, you might have a set of paintbrushes and you don't know which one to use. Maybe an AI tool can help predict and guide you along the way. My certain advice for K-12 education would be like, don't introduce, especially K-6, don't necessarily introduce AI tools until like second semester or much later on in the course, once students have built up a more foundational skill set in that area, whether it's math or language arts. I think it's important for them to sort of understand, for the most part, where you're going, and then maybe start to integrate certain tools along the way. Maybe not necessarily ChatGPT, but for example, in, let's say, early CS education, maybe a limited form of GitHub Copilot might be useful, just as a sort of like AI assist.
Yeah, I also agree with Omar. I don't really think it's feasible to completely ban AI from the classroom, especially because AI is being integrated into more things. But I do think like students should learn skills on how to verify the information they're given from the AI. I think recently I've seen some really disastrous Google search results from the new AI they incorporated, where the information is just absolutely bananas. And if I had no familiarity on a topic and I was searching it up and I didn't know how to verify it, maybe I would just look at, oh, the AI said it's correct. But I think having like a foundation in the topics is vital for being able to, I guess, determine and verify information for learning.
Thank you. Those are really great points and leaves us a lot of food for thought. And I would also like.
Are you telling me that there are not cats on the moon?
Nope, I'm pretty sure there's not, but maybe someone can send one.
Okay.
Work in progress. And on that note, I want to open the floor to our audience for questions. This is a great opportunity for everyone here to engage directly with our speakers and delve deeper into some of the topics today. And we will do our best to address as many questions as possible within the time we have left. And let's get started with our speakers can also pick questions that you find
Yeah,
very interesting.
actually, just on, I'm going to build on Ivy's comment, and then
Awesome. Yes.
question, comment here. Marianne said something about I ask AI to give citations to the answers, and in fact, so this was sort of a whole bunch of examples came out from Google searches with AI summaries, and they actually did link back to the citations for those sources. But in many cases, those citations, if you didn't look at them, were from reputable sources, but there might be an article from the New York Times that talks about misinformation about this topic. And instead of Google saying it was misinformation, it said it was in the New York Times and it was, here's the information. So it's really about not making sure that students know not just to look that there is a citation, but to actually go and read the citation and look at what it's actually saying in there.
Yes. And I do want to add on to that point. I think this is where it becomes really important for educators to sometimes proactively address AI literacy in the classrooms, because what I also notice is there are more and more students who are reading long journal articles with AI. But the problem is when AI summarize, they tend to summarize the point that was there for rebuttal as if it's the main argument of the article if they don't read properly. However, students wouldn't realize until it was pointed out and realize, oh, it's just trained on data set and different text has different weightings in this model. And some of it, I think, are really worth addressing in the classroom setting. I also see a question from Victor, how to define AI literacy? What would be a productive way to define AI literacy?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll try to answer that sort of at a high level. I think there's two components to AI literacy. So one is sort of understanding some of the fundamentals of how AI works. I think that's really important. So as you're just saying, like it's important to know that large language models are sort of word prediction machines based on the training data sets they have. It's important to understand that image generation that's sort of based on text prompts is just sort of like trying to sort of make a picture that sort of looks like a trained set of text prompts that are associated with it. Some of those basic understandings I think are really important to have. They don't need to understand the algorithms per se, but they need to understand something about it. To understand the ethics of it, to understand how it works. And then I think the other thing that is about sort of how to apply those tools. And it's not just the technical aspects of that. So how I prompt engineer well, or how I sort of like fine tune my image generation model, but really about sort of, I think it's about these concepts we've just been talking about, like where do I use them effectively, where do I use them not effectively, where is it important for my own learning, where is it sort of, how does it help my own learning, how does it sort of help communicate my ideas. So all those aspects of about ethical uses of it, appropriate uses of it, appropriate non-uses of it, all those kinds of aspects are really important parts of that.
If I could add one thing to that, sorry. For AI literacy, I think that goes as well with like general CS literacy or computer literacy in general, where students are trying to learn first off how to type, how to interact with the computer, stuff like that. I think incorporating some of that, and as Eric said, making sure students understand, yes, it's basically just sort of a predictor for language, is really important. And I think I took a course with Justin Wright, who's also in the CMS department. And he had this whole one class laid out. It's an ed tech course about ed tech in education in higher ed and in K through 12 education. And he set aside a whole day to sort of just explain the inner workings of ChatGPT and examples of how it's been used in education as well.
Yeah. I do see, I'm looking at the Q&A, some of the questions that are being asked. One question is, so one question I see, it's pretty interesting. What teaching and assignment tips, strategies do you guys have for promoting learning over grades and reinforcing learning over getting the correct answer? I think this is important because I personally observe as well, a lot of people with learning, like you said, learning is integral, but it's part of like the process for it is it can take some time, whereas being able to access, ChatGPT or any other AI tool can take some, it's kind of like a shortcut, as you said. So what are some strategies and tips that you have for promoting learning over grades?
Boy, so I think it's a cultural shift. I think it's hard for a single teacher to do that, although I've seen it. It is possible to have students sort of like focus on that in a class, but I do think it's more generally a sort of a cultural shift that sort of whole school ecosystems need to sort of think about how they manage that. I think it's about the feedback that students get. So now we think of it's primarily about like I'm getting the grade. Feedback that's sort of like more formative along the way is important. You can think about competency-based or mastery-based learning as ways of sort of helping to promote some of that. We can think about similarly, we can think about things like project-based learning that's sort of focused on solving problems and working together and thinking about how all those things sort of come together to help form your own basis for learning. You can think about students sort of defining their own learning outcomes and objectives, getting them much more involved in the process. It also is about the way we sort of frame assessments. If your grade is 50% based on this assessment, we're saying what's important. So what are we assessing along the way? So are we assessing exams and term papers at the end? Are we assessing products along the way? Are we assessing projects that students are creating? So what are we assessing? Because that's what students see as what's valued. Certainly once you get sort of into middle school and high school, they sort of quickly associate the assessment with what's valued. And so if we want to say it's valued, we need to assess those things.
I really wish we could continue the conversation. Fortunately, I think we're approaching the end of the webinar. We didn't have time to get through all the questions, but we will send out a feedback form afterwards. And please feel free to share your questions or comments in the form or by emailing us. We will make sure to share with the speakers as well.
Yeah. That concludes the webinar. That concludes the webinar session. Once again to Eric, Ivy, Omar, and Jacob, thank you guys so much for coming and getting a chance to talk to us. And I do want to summarize sort of what we talked about and gone over. So first, we have fireside chat with Eric, involving his research in working with generative AI and AI for software's involvement in the classroom, discussing how AI presents both an opportunity for people to access tools for certain situations, but how it also presents a challenge in impacting students' learning. And we went over the experiment he conducted with certain groups using AI and not using AI to solve a task, and then also using the stuff that they learned to go over a test, and how, as of some of the findings, when students rely on generative AI for specific things, they won't be able to learn and understand the concepts as much, or compared to someone who doesn't use generative AI. And really, some of the main takeaways from that is that learning is not just remembering things from the class, not just remembering or memorizing certain specific things from the classroom, but it's really just, it's like a social process, and it's really important to understand how something works, and then we can use tools as a resource. And from the students' reaction, we're able to get more information from their perspective. And we saw that the students were able to look at the AI tools as a way to assist in some of the things that they're quite knowledgeable about, and how students use AI as a resource for things that weren't really the core focus of a specific project, or when they weren't an integral part of certain things. But when it came to the actual important things that they had to use and implement, they would really mainly do that on their own. And one of the main takeaways for educators is that it's important for educators to be really clear at the beginning of the learning goals and negotiate with the students such that the students are clear and really on board with those goals. And then from then on, the learning process becomes more clear, and it's a lot easier for students to navigate the class going forward. So once again, thank you so much to Eric, Ivy, Omar, and Jacob for the opportunity to talk to you guys. And thank you so much to all of our audience members who attended today's session. If you're interested in learning more about Eric's latest work, he shared a resource, RAISE, which is a new MIT initiative to innovative learning and education in the era of AI. And with AI X education, our mission is to explore the power of AI to transform education. We're open to any feedback, and if you have any questions or feedback for us, please be sure to scan the QR code on the screen or use the link in the chat. And we'd love to go over, unfortunately, as Sophie mentioned, we'd love to go over all the questions that you guys have for us, but unfortunately, we've reached the end of the session. So if you have any further questions that we didn't get to answer, please be sure to fill out the form or even email us, and be sure to communicate with the speakers today. And if you like to stay updated with our work as well, we have a newsletter that you can subscribe to. And once again, thank you guys so much for attending. And yeah, that concludes the session. Thank you guys.